Hey, Three Crosses family, welcome back to the podcast and happy Easter. My name is Pastor AJ. I oversee life groups and discipleship here at Three Crosses. And today we are having a further discussion on Easter Sunday, the miracle of Jesus's resurrection. And we are so excited to get into this. But before we do, we just want to talk about what is happening next Sunday. On April 27th, we are having our Celebrate New Life service. And so if you've responded to the gospel message over this Easter season, a great next step for you would be to get baptized. And so we're going to have baptisms on Celebrating Life. We're also going to have child dedications. We would love for you to participate in that. And if you're not participating, if you've already been baptized, you've already been dedicated, a great opportunity to invite a friend. It's a great service to hear testimonies of what the Lord is doing in our midst here in the East Bay area. You can sign up and learn more information at threecrosses.church/CNL. threecrosses.church/CNL if you want more information. But we have an exciting conversation about Easter and Jesus' resurrection. And so with that, let's go deeper. Well, joining us to talk about Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, Pastor Danny Strange. Pastor Danny, happy Easter.
Happy Easter to you.
Hopefully you had a great time celebrating with your family, and hopefully you out there as well had just great celebrations of Resurrection Sunday, remembering what Jesus did for us. And so we talked about Romans 6 in the message this Sunday, and so we want to dive deeper. And what I was thinking as we were talking about what we were going to do for this episode, I think there are just a lot of questions around what exactly the Bible teaches about what happened even throughout this Holy Week. We talked a lot last week about the teachings, the events leading up, the betrayals, all these different things leading up during Holy Week. And then you get to the crux of Christianity, the death and resurrection of Jesus. I know there's a lot of questions out there. So I want to work backwards. We're going to eventually land up in Romans 6, but I want to work backwards and talk a little bit about the reasons why we believe what we believe. And so we'll start with the death and resurrection. And I want to start with those two because the death is pretty well attested by scholarship. So you look around, various scholars, whether they're Christian or not, believe that there was a Jesus figure in the first century. And so they kind of have this consensus agreement that somebody died at the hands of Pontius Pilate. You know, there's a couple quote, Tacitus from first century Roman historian, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So there's a first century Roman historian talking about the death of Jesus. And then another one is Josephus, and he's a Jewish historian. He quotes, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship." And so here we have two historians in the time attesting to Jesus' death. We also have the gospel accounts, which we'll talk more a little bit later. The thing that people disagree with the most is what happened after the death, the resurrection, which this day is totally dedicated to celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. And you talked about how looking back to that event and having faith in the resurrection of Jesus is sort of that key to all of Christianity. Even Paul mentions it in 1 Corinthians 15. Like, if there's no resurrection, our faith is futile. It's all worthless. We are to be most pitied. And so just to kick us off here, talk to us about maybe some of the proofs that we have as Christians that cement the idea of Jesus's resurrection. Because there might be some people out there still wrestling with, okay, somebody rose from the dead? Like, that's pretty crazy. It's a pretty crazy thought.
Well, and I think even before we talk about proofs, I'd love to talk a little bit about the stakes of that. You mentioned that Paul quote in 1 Corinthians 15 about if Christ is not raised, our faith is futile, right? And so on one hand, we hear that, we think, oh, well, Christianity is not true if Christ is not raised. And so our faith doesn't even matter. So that's a high stakes statement.
Yeah.
But 1 Corinthians 15 is in the midst of some passages of scripture that talk not merely about Christianity, but about the afterlife. And I think part of it is that what Paul is getting to even in that passage is this idea that if Christ was not raised from the dead, then what hope is there for us to be raised from the dead someday after we die? And so even here on Easter, we've talked a lot about resurrection being new life in the midst of this life. And that is what the resurrection gives us, power to have new life that starts today and never ends. But part of it is most American people who are listening to the podcast, even if they don't believe in Christianity, they believe in some level of afterlife. And what Paul is doing in that passage is saying like, well, how could you possibly believe in an afterlife if God himself couldn't even rise from the dead? And so you're hoping that somehow you're going to rise from the dead or your consciousness will rise from the dead. Like, where's the proof of that? And so the resurrection of Jesus Christ is not merely the proof of Christianity, but we see in the scriptures that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the promise that someday the same will happen to us. And so all of our beliefs about the afterlife, about life after death, about life in heaven, the pinnacle of all that starts when Jesus proves that it's possible and it's true. And so he's described as the first fruits of those who rose from the dead in the scriptures. So he's the first one, and the rest of us will follow. And so part of the stakes of this question that we're wrestling with is, well, if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, how can any of us believe, not even in Christianity, but in the afterlife? Because this just seems like this weird concept that we've all just invented, that we just hope someday there's life after death. Yeah. But the resurrection proves there is life after death, because the one who created this place shows us what life after death looks like when he rises himself from the dead. And so the stakes are pretty high.
And it does seem in our cultural milieu, like our cultural waters that we swim in, it does seem like there is some infatuation with people cheating death. You know, you could look at the first century and there was a lot of different ideas around, man, like I hope somebody has that power to conquer death. And you think about all of the movies that come out, you know, like I'm thinking like Avengers right now, where it's like, yeah, you can get like a time capsule, go back in time and like change different things so that you can cheat death again. And so like, it does seem like this carries a lot of weight.
Well, and there's something in us too that just believes that there's something after this life where, you know, I talk to people all the time who are not religious people or Christian people, and yet I'm connecting with them because we're in relationship or we're friends or whatever, and we're talking about one of their loved ones who passed away, and they always say, well, they're in a better place. Oh, well, you know, they've escaped pain, and you know, now they're in heaven. And I never ask, but I want to ask, like, what do you mean by that? And where do you get this idea of heaven? Like, you're not a religious person. You say you don't believe in God, but you somehow believe there's this place called heaven that your loved one is now in? Like, what literally do you mean by that? And so part of what the Christian faith gives us is the mechanics and the explanation and kind of foretaste of what that kingdom of heaven looks like in the person of Jesus Christ as he resurrects. But I will point out that most humans that I talk to believe deep inside that there is some sort of life after death. And so when we see the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it's like the proof of that thing we already believe. So it is kind of funny that we approach that event with this posture of skepticism, like, oh, well, we don't believe in that. But we still believe in this life after death concept that now there's nothing that point. If Jesus wasn't raised, for the atheistic person, where do you get a concept of heaven or the afterlife if no one has ever been raised from the dead? Why do you think you're going to be raised from the dead on the other side of death? And so, you know, I know there's a fair amount of people who say, oh no, once we're dead, it's over. But they say that, but then every time I'm talking to somebody who has someone that they care about who's passed away, they always drop in that line about heaven, about better place. And you wonder, what is it in you? Something in you knows that this world is not the end. There's something on the other side. And so even though we're going to talk today about Jesus being from a skeptical point of view, I do want to point out that most of us don't approach life after death in general with skepticism. We approach it with optimism. And yet, for some reason, we approach the resurrection of Jesus with skepticism, which I would say if Jesus can't even rise from the dead, what hope is there for you to rise from the dead?
Yeah, because even in other world religions, I'm thinking somebody's got to do it, right? Somebody has to be the enlightened one that ends up, you know, through all the iterations of existence, has to end up in nirvana or whatever. Like somebody's got to cross that barrier.
And sometimes, some religious kind of myth stories is like, well, it's immortality. They found a way, you know, whether it's like fountain of youth stuff or whatever, to avoid needing to die. Others of it, even today, we talk a lot about like biohacking and stuff in our culture. Is there a way to push off death and so we can be immortal by living for longer? Is there a way that through collecting our consciousness in computers, we can live forever somehow?
Wow.
And so that's all like pushing back death. But no one's been able to do any work on life after death because it's all, you know, I mean, there's been experiments. I mean, that's probably for a different podcast of like, people trying to figure out what happens to a body after someone dies and the weight of their body changes. Like these are like the 1920s experiments and stuff. But there's not a lot of research, obviously, on what happens after you die because no one's there, right? They're gone. And we know there's something on the other side, but we have a hard time putting our finger on it. So I guess all that I'm saying is when Jesus raises from the dead, he gives us a glimpse of what resurrection looks like. This thing that we've all been imagining as a shadow in the back of our minds that someday I hope I'm alive after I die. Well, here's a guy who was alive after he died and he came back and taught us about it. And so I would just encourage, if you're saying, hey, I don't think Jesus raised from the dead, then also question, why do you believe that there is afterlife in general? And if you believe in an afterlife, well, then what Jesus did is not that far-fetched. You assume it's going to happen to you too. This is either crazy or it's not.
Well, you give us a lot of plots for some good sci-fi movies right there. What happens to your conscience when it gets plugged into a computer forever? That's a very interesting one. But what gives us the confidence then that Jesus is the one who did it? Like, what gives us the confidence in terms of looking back at the evidence and saying, yeah, Jesus is the one? Because we're talking about an event that happened 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple source documents we could look at. One is these historians that talk about the death of Jesus. And there's even some historians that even talk about kind of the supernatural events that happen on the day of the death of Jesus. We could also look at the scriptures that talk about the raising of Jesus Christ from the dead. And it's easy to be like, oh, well, that's circular reasoning, right? We believe that Jesus raised because the Bible said so. It's like, well, how do you know he did? Well, because the Bible said so. Well, how do you know the Bible's reliable? Because it said so. But we do have to point out is when you read the Bible as a historical document, it doesn't read like a propaganda piece, right? It reads like someone trying to give a historical account to show why what happened. Like we see skepticism in the scriptures. We see Jesus resurrecting and appearing to women, which in a first century context, people would be like, well, that testimony from these women is not valid because you need to have men there in the first century. And so there's all these places where you can poke holes totally at the Bible and be like, well, even if that happened, even if women said he raised from the dead, I don't believe it. Or, you have Thomas who sees him and he's doubting. You see Jesus walking down the road to Emmaus and people see him, but they don't really recognize him. And you're thinking, man, if this was a propaganda piece written to prove the resurrection, you did a really bad job at it because the first witnesses are not reliable evidence that can be used in court. These people are squinting and they can't understand it. Jesus has to prove himself to Thomas. And so on one hand, you read the Bible and you think, well, you could have written a way better propaganda piece. So why do you write it this way? And the most logical reason is, well, they're just writing what actually happened. And then on the other side, when you read the scriptures, we do see that Jesus predicts that he's going to do this, and then he does it. And you also see stuff that does line up with the historical evidence that there was such a fear that this like religious cult would be created on the other side of the death of Jesus, that even the Roman government does stuff like guards the body, puts a stone in front of the tomb, right? Puts these Roman soldiers in the way that is supposed to be in that first century world. Now there's no way, right? It's because the disciples are going to claim that he was resurrected, but they really stole the body. And so the Roman soldiers are like, no one's stealing the body. Yeah. They'll have to come through us, right? And so all the miracles that had to happen, not even the resurrection miracle, but the miracle of, well, how did these soldiers misguard the body? How did this stone get rolled away? How did all of these things happen? That when the women show up at the tomb, the soldiers are asleep or gone and the stone is rolled away and Jesus is gone. And they're like, oh no, what happened to the body? Everything had to line up and fall apart in order for like these disciples to somehow steal the body and then start a religion out of it, So it's funny when you read the scriptures, you see that even though some of those historians said, yeah, their disciples stayed with him forever, they're probably referring to the fact that the disciples kept on being disciples of Jesus after the resurrection. When you read the biblical account, you see that they actually kind of abandoned Jesus at the crucifixion. You see Peter denying Jesus. You see John is the only disciple left at the cross. Everybody else kind of scatters even after the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. They kind of go back into real life. They go back to Galilee. They're trying to figure out how to live. And so you see that it kind of feels like the movement's over because their leader is dead. And then something happens that if it wasn't the resurrection, I don't know what it was, but something happens that takes these 12 guys who've kind of scattered and given up hope because their leader's gone and the Messiah is no Messiah at all because he's a dead Messiah. And And then all of a sudden they flip a switch and now they turn a full 180, and these cowards are now these bold people and they're sharing these messages, and now power is coming through them and miracles are happening, and the things that before only Jesus could do now they're doing somehow, and they're being released from prison and they're going out and sharing this message, and it starts spreading like wildfire across the entire earth. And something happened between the moment where he died and all hope was gone and the moment where it's almost like this spark reemerges that lights the whole world on fire. And now 2,000 years later, there's millions and millions of people who believe this story. Something happened after his death that changed everything. And so if it wasn't the resurrection, I mean, the bigger question is, well, then what was it that somehow ignited this movement that changed the entire world forever? Even though the disciples got nothing out of it, it cost them their lives. They died martyrs' deaths, or even John, who wasn't martyred, pretty much was. He was given a life sentence in prison on Patmos. They got nothing. They didn't get any riches. All the stuff that they were scared of happened to them, but somehow none of them let go of the story, even though it cost them everything and gained them nothing. Why? What changed to make these 12 ordinary men and all these women who came to pay their respects to the dead Jesus to change everything? So now this story is spreading like wildfire across the world. Something happened.
Yeah. And I can hear some people, maybe skeptics out there, thinking like, well, you're just getting that story from scripture. So like back to the circular reasoning.
I mean, the story I'm not getting from scripture is the story that you and I are sitting here today believing in Jesus.
Right.
Yeah. And so it's like, it's not like a Bible dropped out of thin air 100 years ago and we read it and we decided to believe it. Yeah. There's been a continuous line of worshipers of Jesus that's been growing exponentially through the countries, through the history of the world. And you trace it all back to something that happened after the death of Jesus that sparked a movement. So even without the Bible, this all happened. And so we read about it historically in the Bible, but even if the Bible wasn't something we had access to, the world is still changing through the resurrection. And even this, like we talked about on Sunday, people's lives are changing by believing in this resurrection, and the Spirit is transforming them. Something is still happening within us by believing this story. And so, even if we didn't have the Bible, well, this all happened. This religion started. Millions and millions and millions and millions of people have been converted. Why? Like where did this come from?
Yeah. And even outside of the scriptures of the Bible, Josephus' quote continues, "The disciples reported that he had appeared to them after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. And the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day." Really fascinating quote that's outside of scriptures that's suggesting that at least the claim existed, right? Josephus wasn't going so far to say as this was true, but he was saying like something happened. Like the question that you're posing, like why did this happen? Some sort of claim was being made about Jesus appearing to them after. And
it just feels like, I mean, if you're a disciple, the 12 disciples have this Jewish background. They followed Jesus like their rabbi. They hoped that he was going to be the one who changed the world. And then he dies. And it's like, oh, geez, like we thought he was going to be the savior of the world. He didn't. He's dead now. Can you imagine these 12 guys coming together and be like, okay, let's
cook something up.
Let's say he rose from the dead, even though we know he didn't. And let's start a new movement within our religion that we know is false. And let's lead all of our countrymen and people around the world astray from what is true to perpetuate this lie. For what reason?
And let's die for it.
Like the only reason to be like, because I'm so embarrassed I followed him for 3 years and I wasted my life. So let's make up a lie. Like, because like we said, they don't get anything out of it. The world turns against them. At some point, if they were making it up, they'd be like, okay, please don't kill me. We made it up. Like, but they all held on to this. Even like Jesus's biological family converts. So, I mean, you're not going to do that. If you've got brothers or sisters, like if your brother, if somebody made up a story that your brother raised from the dead and you knew it wasn't true, you would be the first person as a biological sibling to be like, that's crazy. Like, just let it go. He's dead. Yeah. And so it's just, there's got to be what's the explanation other than that it happened? It's like that Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is that something happened that these disciples saw. And that's the message they share, right? John in 1 John 1 just says, let me tell you what I'm telling you about the word of life, Jesus. He says, the life appeared. We saw him with our own eyes. We touched him with our own hands. They're really holding on to the only people who get to write the Bible are people who saw him, touched him themselves, right? So then Paul, when he writes his encounter with Jesus, he's like, I saw him myself. He appeared to me on the road to Damascus, right after his ascension. I witnessed it myself. You had to be an eyewitness of this thing. You weren't allowed to be someone who heard it secondhand. You weren't allowed to be a second, third generation Christian. You had to witness Jesus Christ yourself to be an author of Scripture. And so it's like they took such pride in like, we saw this ourselves and we're telling you the story. Mm-hmm. So why would you, getting nothing out of it, why would you write a story like that unless you at the very least deeply believed it? And why would you, what is this, like a mass hallucination effect or something? They weren't even together at that time. Like you've got to bend over backward. Like I can't think of any other, I'm sure there's something, but I can't think of any other movement in the history of the world that lasted more than a couple minutes where people deeply believed something that was false that affected them all separately, and they came together and then started this movement and it had the power to sustain itself beyond them even to one more generation.
Yeah, especially like, under heavy persecution.
Yes, like even like every Empire. Cult, you think of like David Koresh in Waco, Texas and all that back in the 80s, whenever that was, it's like there were some crazy people who believe some crazy stuff about, you know, like the Branch Davidians, all these folks, like, but it just died when they died. Like it, and yeah, they got, you know, the police came after them, people died in the compound. And so, but it's not like then a new generation emerged of like, no, they were right. It's always like those people were crazy. And it's funny, like as much, I hear people all the time talk about like, oh yeah, I don't think the resurrection happened. I think it's just a story. I've never heard someone say, I think the disciples are crazy, but it's like, kind of like when C.S. Lewis talks about Jesus, either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. It's like, well, also the disciples, they were either crazy or they were right. Like like they're either crazy cult people, like the folks who take poison and go sleep in the desert or whatever, or they're waiting for the alien to come, or they're right. Like they're not just good guys who started a religion for some reason. Like, so it's funny. Like I've never heard someone say the disciples are crazy. Their writings are so methodical and they align so well. And it like doesn't feel like they're trying to prove anything. They're just like laying out what they experienced. And even their whole thing is like, this is just what I saw. And then all of a sudden, I started touching people and they got healed. And people are like, I got healed. And like, this is how it spread. It's that these miracles were spreading through them to others. And the word was spreading like wildfire. They almost, this is why they're called Christians. They were like these little Christs that somehow his resurrection resurrected them. And now they can do the things that he did. And even at a greater level. And so the power of what happened after the resurrection is like the proof of the pudding is, it literally was changing the world and changing lives, and people were being raised from the dead and being healed. And like, again, I've never seen a crazy cult get started. And then the reason that it picks up steam is because people start raising from the dead and healing. Right. And if they did, you'd be like, there might be something to this, right? And so part of it, like the irrefutable evidence is not merely the resurrection event itself, but what happened afterwards, not just the disciples converting to, I'm all in on this Christianity thing when I was about to abandon it, but then all these folks who are experiencing this healing and this miracle and their lives changing, and then these miraculous events happening around the world. And even one of those historians that you mentioned talk about on the cross when the skies became dark, and this was this like global phenomenon where from another country or part of the ancient empire, they're like, man, the skies got really dark. I wonder what happened. These were miraculous things that were happening in the world. So it's like, oh yeah, Jesus died on the cross. And by the way, the skies all went black while he was dying, like he said was going to. But I mean, that's all the other stuff is crazy. It's like, that's crazy too. Like the historical stuff's crazy too, you know? So yeah, I've never heard a thought experiment that is consistent from beginning to end. The only consistent line that makes sense is that it happened, and that's why X, Y, Z, A, B, C happened. Because how do you explain all this other peripheral stuff if the first thing didn't happen?
Yeah, and I think we wanted to start here because it is so foundational. Like if this happened, it should change everything, right? And if you're still having questions, one of the series that we did was an Explore God series, and we talked about the veracity of the Bible and how it often reads like eyewitness accounts, like all the different like things happening, all the disciples coming together, and they're doing their best to recount an actual event in history. And so it's just really neat all the different ways that, I mean, Occam's razor, back to like the simplest explanation, might literally be that this actually happened. Like Jesus is the one that rose from the dead.
Well, and that's the thing. Like when you look at the Old Testament, there's some sections of the Old Testament that people push back on with skepticism. They're like, there's no way that battle had that many people in it. There's no way that King David had this much that, or that Solomon had this much riches, or all these grandiose things that happen. Like this feels like propaganda. And so it's, that's a whole different question of like, okay, how do we prove those things happen? That's the interesting thing about the New Testament is like, there's no propaganda. There's no like, you don't read the story and think that's crazy. It's not, on one hand, like they preach the word to 3,000 people come to Christ. That's like a big number, but it's not like, and then they all like were able to fly. And then like, just like Jesus walked through that wall, then they walked through wall. Like there's nothing that you read and you think that's impossible. The only event that you read in the New Testament that you think is impossible is the resurrection of Jesus. Everything else just reads like normal. So it's like
documentation.
Yeah, what is happened? The cause for all this like basic documented stuff where, I think of like a tsunami, like an earthquake happens and then a tsunami hits and all these buildings fall down and the cities are flooded and people die. And you could be like, well, I don't believe there was a tsunami. It's like, okay, well, how did the city get flooded and all the people die and the buildings fall down? It's like, that's a bigger miracle than a tsunami happening. Like, what is the cause for all of the effect that we see? And so we see the effect in world history of the resurrection. We see the effect in the disciples of the resurrection. We see the effect in our own personal lives of the resurrection. And so at some level, you got to say, well, if the cause didn't happen, why is this effect? What is the first cause of these things? Because it's a bigger miracle if Jesus didn't resurrect and the disciples got converted, and if Jesus didn't resurrect and miracles happened, and if Jesus didn't resurrect and the world was changed, and Jesus didn't resurrect but this message just changes us from the inside out. That's a bigger miracle, it almost feels like, because now there's no cause. It's just,
it just
out
happened.
of the blue, So the simplest solution is that all of these effects we've seen throughout world history, in our own lives, in the scriptures, they all have the same cause. There was a tsunami, and that tsunami was the resurrection of Jesus Christ that wreaked good havoc throughout the earth, just like he said it was going to do. If a seed falls on the ground and dies, it bears much fruit. If it doesn't, it's only a seed. He says that the gospel is like this seed that's going to take over the entire world. He didn't merely predict his own death and resurrection. He correctly predicted everything that would happen after that. And so Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these hundreds of Old Testament prophecies. And then he's the fulfillment of all of his own prophecies into the future for the next 2,000 years. Like you could even just say take like a Malcolm Gladwell thing and be like, well, it's likely to happen to someone. It's like, I don't think this is likely to happen to anybody. It's like all these prophecies about them is true. And then they make up all these new ones about what will happen after they die. And then all those come true. It's like, that's the crazy thing is some of that stuff was written before he was born. Some of that stuff he said with his own mouth. Some of that stuff was written about after he died. And then it happened thousands of years later. It's like, this is insane. Like this is the pinnacle moment in all of history that everything in the Old Testament is pointing towards, that everything that's happened ever since is pointing back to. And so if this didn't happen, it's not just why did our calendars change from BC to AD if Jesus wasn't significant, but like in a more global sense, why has everything happened in the history of the world the way that it did if not everything in the scriptures that said we're going to happen did not happen? It all lines up so perfectly. It's way harder not to believe it than to believe it.
I want to use this as like a hinge point in the conversation because I do feel like it is a hinge point, like from the passage in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul says, if this is true, like it changes everything. And I'm reminded of a quote that you brought up in Sermon Review of Andy Stanley, who's a pastor. And he said, if a man can predict his own death and resurrection and actually pull it off, I just go with whatever the man says. I love that quote. It's so simple. It's like, if this guy can do that and like you're saying, all these different prophecies, all these different predictions that come out to be true, like this entire movement that has existed up until like today, everything that you've mentioned, it makes you rethink Jesus. It makes you relook at Jesus. And so let's look at the life of Jesus for now. Let's like narrow down to like his teachings, his life, the way he lived. We can look at him and say, okay, this guy might know more than me, might know more than us. And it feels like a debate around the East Bay and even in our culture today is like, who has the accurate depiction of God? Like there's a lot of religions out there. There's a lot of theories about what's in the afterlife. There's a lot of different, presentations of who God is. So who did Jesus the guy who rose from the dead that we should probably listen to, who did Jesus believe that God was?
Yeah, it's funny. So on one hand, Jesus believed in the God of the Old Testament. So when he comes and walks the earth, he points back to the Old Testament oftentimes, and he not only points back to it as true, but then sometimes he says, this is true, but you've missed the heart of it. Let me tell you about the heart of the God of the Old Testament. Right? And so, think of that famous passage in John chapter 8, I think it is, or 9, where that woman is caught in adultery, and the people are like, well, we have to kill her because the Old Testament tells us to. And Jesus steps into that space and says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, and write something on the ground that we don't get access to. And somehow we all read that and we're like, okay, somehow this guy understands the heart of the God of the Old Testament better than the religious leaders of the first century did. So Jesus believed in the God of the Old Testament. Jesus was able to draw out the heart of the God of the Old Testament. And then Jesus makes bold claims that he was also the God of the Old Testament, right? And so I think this is John 8, where he's talking to the religious leaders, and they're saying, well, hey, we're children of Abraham. He's like, we're actually children of the devil. And then he makes this, I think it's like 8:41 or something. He says, well, I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am. And he invokes the name of the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh. This is I am what I am. This is what God revealed himself to Moses as, the covenant name of God throughout the Old Testament. I am. And we'd be like, oh, well, he just said that. He might not have known what he was talking about. Everybody knew what he was talking about, because then they try to kill him, right?
Try to pick up stones and get,
over and over again. Jesus is like saying, at one point the disciples try to worship Jesus, and they allow him to. Where it's like, not even angels allow humans to worship them. Only God is allowed to be worshipped. Even when Thomas puts his hands in the crucifixion marks of Jesus and says, unless I see it with my own eyes, I'll never believe. So Jesus says, touch me and believe. And Thomas says, my Lord and my God. And he exclaims that, like, you are the God of the Old Testament. You are the God of the Bible. You are the God of the universe. You are the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the one who commands all things. And so we see that in Jesus' miracles, where he calms the sea. It's a depiction of he is the one that with a word can calm the earth and recreate it. And even in the resurrection, he is the one who gives life. The Spirit of God gives life to Jesus. So, Jesus believed in the God of the Jewish people, not as they understood him in the first century, because a lot of corruption had come into the religious system that he was coming to point out, and he talked about a lot. But he didn't say, hey, forget all that, I'm going to give you something new. He said, actually, let me tell you about the heart of these scriptures, and let me tell you the reason I know it is because I am the one who was there with Father and Spirit in the creation event. And now we go back to the Old Testament and we start reading some of these things and think, oh wait, what does that mean? What does it mean that when God says, let us create man in our own image, right? Is that merely just a way people talked back then? Or was he talking about this plurality of like triune divinity that is Father, Son, and Spirit? What does it mean when God says, let there be light, and the Spirit hovers over the surface of the waters? And in the New Testament says, Christ was the word that was spoken, and all of these, the Godhead is working in concert, in unity, Father, Son, and Spirit, in triunity. And so we kind of look back through New Testament eyes. We're like, oh my gosh, Jesus was the God of the Old Testament. With these they call them pre-incarnate Christophanies, these moments in human history where it seems like an angelic being visits earth, but then you find it actually is God in flesh visiting earth. And we realize later, oh, that was Jesus who came to visit earth when God put on flesh, even before the incarnation. And so, yes, Jesus claimed to be and was the God of the universe, put on flesh and dwelling among the people. And in the story that he tells about it, he says, I had this plan for you, my people. You all went rebellious against me. So I sent prophets, like human messengers who could speak the truth. You killed them all. And so I sent more and more and more. You killed them all. And so finally I'm like, I'm going to come down there myself, right? God says, I'm going to send my son. Sure, they'd listen to him, and you kill him too. And then, like Paul says later, but the stone the builders rejected becomes the chief cornerstone, that now Christ is the foundation of the church, and his resurrection shows he wasn't just a mere prophet. He wasn't just another person messenger for God. This was different this time, and he starts something new. Yeah, and I think this is such a key element to understand as you're reading the New Testament. Maybe you're out there and you're thinking, man, I should revisit my Bible, and thinking through the lens of Jesus' claim to be God in the flesh, I think is a key element in understanding this, because when he does heal sin or heal people, like he's saying, I forgive you.
And like, that is something that only God can do. Or, he is a miracle worker, and, all the different claims of the Old Testament. It's like almost in everything that he's doing, he's making some allusion to who he is and his identity. And so looking out for that is really important. I want to throw in a pushback though, because in John, he says like, I and the Father are one, but then he also has this like interesting thing of like almost submitting to the Father. Like, I only do what the Father tells me to do. So how do you explain that,
I think if you're going to make an argument that the Apostle John didn't believe that Jesus was in fact God, I would say before you do that, jump back to the first chapter, the first verse of the book of John, where John's narrative starts with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God in the beginning. The Word put on flesh and dwelt among us. And so John starts his gospel making a case that Jesus was present with the Father at the creation account, hearkening back to Genesis 1:1, and saying he is the God of the Old Testament put on flesh and dwelt among us. And so John believed it. And so either John changed his mind over a couple of chapters, or what John is drawing out is kind of this idea of we believe in a triune God of Father, Son, and Spirit who live. The theological term is perichoresis, which means like to dance around. This idea that Father, Son, and Spirit are one God who exists eternally as three persons in one God. And there's this idea that the Father has some primacy in the Trinity, that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, that the Son is this eternally begotten Son of God, and that there's this relationship between the three. And so even Jesus, when he puts on flesh and dwells among us, he continues the submission that he has to the Father and to the Spirit that he's had his entire, for all eternity. But at the same time, he also is putting on flesh and living as a human and showing us what it looks like to submit to the Father. And so Jesus as human submits to God like all of us should. Jesus as divine submits to the Father like we see in the Trinitarian relationship, Father, Son, and Spirit co-submitting to one another. And that's where we get some of these patterns like we've talked about in a few podcasts ago about human submission one to another. This comes out of this divine submission, one member of the Godhead to one another. And so doesn't refute it. If anything, it speaks to his divinity and his humanity, that he still remains in submission to the Father, even in the midst of his incarnation. Yeah,
I think it's also fascinating too about how you said Jesus would align himself with the God of the Old Testament in particular, because there are a lot of ancient religions out there, and Jesus specifically throws quotations all the time alluding to the law of Moses, the prophets, and the writings, which is the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament that we have in our hands today. And so he saw himself as the continuation, the fulfillment of that. And so he is aligning. You can't just throw away the Old Testament, right? Like Jesus saw the Old Testament as, his story that he was fulfilling. And so I think that's really fascinating too. If you're looking at other religions and maybe wondering, what about the other religions? Well, it seems like the guy who rose from the dead, right? That being our core principle, our foundation. The guy who rose from the dead is aligning himself with the Old Testament and saying, I'm the fulfillment. I was with God. I am God in the flesh. So,
well, that's, it's funny when you think about, from a skeptic's point of view, there are not a lot of religious figures that are universally adored throughout time. And Jesus is one. Mother Teresa didn't claim to be God, but she's probably one that everybody's like, oh, and Mother Teresa, who claimed that Jesus resurrected, and she followed him. We've got probably Gandhi as someone that everybody loves, who also was intrigued with Jesus, didn't like Christians, but saw something in Jesus, right? Maybe Buddha, but I don't think anybody really knows about Buddha like they know about Gandhi and Mother Teresa. And so it's interesting that Gandhi didn't claim to be God, I don't think. Mother Teresa didn't claim to be God. Jesus claimed to be God. Jesus made a lot of bold claims that would make it very hard to revere him. So it's like we can say, oh, well, he didn't really raise from the dead. He was just a good teacher. But he was a good teacher who taught all these things that you and I have been talking about right now on this podcast. He taught that he was the God of the Old Testament. He taught that, right, unless you believe in him, you're not have access to the Father. He taught a lot of exclusive things. And so it's like, well, yeah, but everything else he teaches is so revolutionary. And so that's the interesting thing too about the Old Testament and the New Testament is both of them in their times and still today, when we understand them, especially in the time in which they were written, were the most life-giving expressions of religion imaginable. So like the Old Testament was written and with a backdrop of all these other ancient religions that were all about child sacrifice and mutilation and cutting ourselves and doing all these heinous things and claiming it religion. The God of the Old Testament was like, no, I'm not that kind of God. I don't war with other gods. I am above all other gods. I've called you to have life. I've created you out of my joy. And it's just this life-giving expression of religion and worship, unlike anything the world had seen at that time. Then the New Testament comes out, and Jesus kind of cleans up some of where humans had turned the religion into a mess and points back to the Old Testament and says, read it again. Like, you're missing the point. And then the religion that comes out of Jesus encapsulates the God of the Old Testament, what we learn about him in the Old Testament, and also like the teachings of Jesus that show what God meant when he said those things and creates all of these ethics that we all think are beautiful today. People love forgiveness today. Well, that's like Christianity has the corner on forgiveness. That's where that came from. We love the teachings of Jesus because it's about caring for the stranger and caring for the marginalized and hope for the broken and loving everyone and not making favorites. Jesus is the heart of God in human flesh. And so unlike any other major deity that oversees any other world religion, it's like, that's the one that aligns most with reason. We're like, yes, this makes sense. Where it's, we study, you could study on the other side, these ancient religions and talk about the barbaric nature of these religions surrounding Israel in the Old Testament, or even religions like Islam that came out of kind of a perversion of the Old Testament and the New Testament, saying, well, let me recapitulate the Old Testament and bring out the New Testament through the lens of violence, and God being a God of wrath and violence being kind of core to the Muslim religion. It's kind of rereading the Old Testament through violent eyes, where we're like, well, no, what do we prefer? Rereading it through violent eyes or looking at it through the lens of Jesus and seeing it again through the compassionate and loving eyes of God, who says, I'm entering into a covenant relationship with you like you're my spouse. So Jesus' interpretation of the Old Testament and Islam's interpretation of the Old Testament are vastly different. And Jesus is the one world character, not Muhammad, not Joseph Smith, not Confucius, not anybody else that everybody's like, well, he got something right. But he also believed that he was God, and then he was going to raise from the dead, and then he claims that he did it started a movement. And so it's just it's another one of those things that's like, well, what's more logically true? That he was like the best teacher in the history of the world, who had the best tap on religion, who understood the Old Testament better than anyone else, who created the most beautiful religion known to humankind, but he also was a crazy person who thought he was God, and then had this like death that he claimed later ended in resurrection, but he lied about the whole thing. It's just like, you can't have both, right? Jesus, like C.S. Lewis said, is either liar, lunatic, or Lord. And so if you think the teachings of Jesus are beautiful, life-giving, you either have to admit that they came out of a crazy person, or admit that maybe he was right, not just about the moralistic stuff, but about his own identity as well.
And I think that's where I want to go next, because if we stop at only his teachings, we miss Good Friday, which was the death. I mean, you think about like any teaching, it's like, hey, I want to teach you something and I just want to go die. It's like, that's kind of a weird teaching. I mean, I suppose you can grab some moral teachings through it, but it seems like something else is at play here. And so maybe there's some people out there still listening and saying, okay, well, if Jesus rose from the dead, I mean, that's awesome. If Jesus was a great teacher, that's awesome. If he was God in the flesh, that's awesome. But then why did Jesus have to die? Like what was at play in Jesus's life or in the situation that Jesus saw that his mission was to die on the cross? So why the cross? Why is God like a violent God? I mean, going back to that whole conversation, why the cross?
It's interesting when you even read the New Testament, you get this idea that aligns with historical evidence that the people in Jesus' day, even who were following Jesus closely, didn't really know where he was going. And so he would speak about his death and how it was upcoming and he's going to be handed over. He'd say it even explicitly, the Son of Man will be handed over to be put to death. And they're like, no way.
Yeah,
like,
I'm not
surely not,
happen.
Lord.
No
Absolutely not. We're not going to let this happen. Because they had this narrative in their minds that Jesus was going to be the king of the world and he was going to either take down the religious establishment and or take down the Roman Empire. And he was going to do that by ascending to a throne and ruling with an iron fist over all of the Jewish people or the ancient Near Eastern people, kind of depending on the vantage point that folks were coming from. And so what people imagined that Jesus was going to do was that Jesus was going to go and conquer some enemy and then go ascend to some throne and then going to rule over the world, right? And so it's interesting when you watch the events of Holy Week through this lens. Jesus comes on Palm Sunday, and he's riding on this donkey, which is like, well, that's kind of strange. I wish it was a war horse, but it's a donkey, but hey, we'll give him a pass. And then he goes up the steps to the temple. You're like, oh, here he goes. He's ascending to his throne. But instead of sitting down on the throne of the temple, he starts turning over the tables in the temple. You're like, what are you doing? And then things start turning the corner. And it's like, oh no, Jesus, you went too far. Now they're going to kill you. Now you'll never rise to the throne. And then later, you see they do kill him. And then 40 days later, he does ascend to a throne, not a throne on earth, but a throne in heaven. And so the ascension of Jesus is critical in understanding this whole thing. But I think if we now take a step back and say, okay, wait, hold on. We thought Jesus was going to conquer an enemy and then rise to a throne. What actually happened? And then you read the New Testament again, you're like, oh, wow, like he did that. It was just not an enemy that we thought he was going to conquer. It was a different one where Jesus was not trying to kill the enemy of Rome. Jesus was not trying to destroy the enemy of the Jewish people. The enemy that Jesus had his sights on were the enemy of sin, the enemy of death. And so as Jesus is put on the cross, he goes and fights against death, and it seems like death has won. And then we see, like in the Westminster Catechism, that he descends into Hades and emerges victoriously. Like this idea that he descends into hell itself, takes on hell, takes on death, takes on the devil, kills it all, comes out of, this is like where it becomes a cool movie, comes out of the grave like a warrior with the head of Satan on his hand, in his hand or something. And then he is qualified to ascend a throne, not a throne in a temple, not a throne in Rome, but a throne in the heavenly places itself. And so the fundamental reason that we would see the cross in the story, just looking at the narrative, is that Jesus had to conquer an enemy, and the enemy that he said he was coming after was the enemy of sin and the enemy of death. And so he conquers death by dying and rising from it. He conquers sin by suffering for it and then forgiving it. And we see that the cross becomes that place where he took on the enemy of Satan, he took on the enemy of sin, and then after the cross, he took on the enemy of death and emerged from all three victorious. And so, the cross is a moment in human history that has so much significance. It's really hard. That was just one line you can take through it. Scott McKnight wrote a book called A Community Called Atonement. And he talks about the fact that you could look at the cross through like 8 different lenses and see that so many things happened in that moment. Like on one hand, he gives himself up as an offering to God, just like you would sacrifice a lamb as an offering to God and say, God, this is yours. He says, he commits his spirit into God's hands. And so it's like this act of perfect submission to offer his life as a sacrifice. We see this idea that he pays the penalty for sin, that the wages of sin is death, and Christ paid the penalty of sin. He died a sinner's death on a cross. He was cursed so that we don't have to get the death penalty.
Sorry.
I've been in your seat.
Oh, man. I'm going to write that down. 48 minutes.
So he was cursed so that we didn't have to pay the death penalty for our sin. Right? And these are just a couple. He conquers sin and death, like we talked about. There are so many things that happen. This idea of like that he was the victor, even though he was the suffering servant, right? All of these different things. The cross has so much weight of significance, even in the midst of the sacrificial system. You see that when Jesus cries out with a loud voice, the temple curtain is torn from top to bottom. Like, I am the last sacrifice. Like, there's so much that's happening that on one hand, you can ask, well, why did it have to happen that way?
Right.
On the other hand, you can come at it and be like, wow, like, if you had to design one way to fulfill every single thing in the Bible, human history, and human nature in one event in 3 hours, it all comes together in that moment. I can't think of a better way to do everything that was accomplished on the cross. Like, on one hand, if he's going to conquer death, he's got to get into the tomb. How's he going to do it? Like, he could take cyanide, but instead he dies on a criminal's cross, which has extra significance as a punishment, which has extra significance as a sacrifice, which has other significance as the weight of our sin, as a penal substitute, which has other significance. It's like the cross is such a weighty thing that even becomes a stumbling block where the people don't want to believe because like, well, we can't follow anyone who's been put on a cross. They're dirty. And it's like, no, he actually is the one who was made dirty so that we might be made clean. So it's like the perfect moment and symbol for everything that needs to be fulfilled. So it's, again, if it's a movie, you're thinking, man, how are they going to tie up all these loose ends? We've only got like 5 minutes left. And then one thing happens and you're like,
they did it.
They did it. Every single thing that didn't need to get paid off got paid off in the most unexpected way. And then you think, but now he's dead. And then when the resurrection happens, you're like, this is the best movie I've ever seen. That's where it's just like, again, the disciples had to be geniuses to make all this up at the very least, right?
Right.
So it's, wow.
Well, I think the book of Romans is where you landed on this past Sunday. And I think if you're interested in reading the book of Romans, I think it does give a lot of different reasons like why it had to be like this. Just considering the entire story of the Old Testament, all these different humans failing, falling short. And then finally, like the Lord himself stepping in the flesh, like putting an end. There's a quote that talks about like what Jesus assumed he was looking to redeem. So like by Jesus becoming flesh and dwelling among us, he's looking to redeem humanity. And then all the, symbolic images of animal sacrifice in the Old Testament gets paid off on the cross. There's just so much atonement conversation. So
and the one that we haven't talked about is the simplest one, which was like, he didn't stick himself there.
Right.
Like humankind turned against him,
right,
and they stuck him there to put an end to his ministry.
Right.
But the thing that they did to put an end to it actually was the peak of it that accomplished everything he set out to do. Yeah. And he didn't put himself on the cross, like he didn't fight it, but we put him on the cross. And so that's part of the whole, like, even if Jesus is a religious mastermind, he didn't, if you're reading the story, he's not the one that looks like calling the shots. We are. Yeah. And we're like, we got him now. I mean, it's just like yeah, it's beautifully crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, the simplest answer to the whole thing is like, well, why the cross? Is because that's where we put him. That's probably what we would do to God again if he came to the earth, because we want to reject God and live lives, the way that we have since the beginning. It fits the narrative of the entirety of the Bible all together, where he says, right, like you always, this is what the apostles say on the other side of the cross, you always reject the Holy Spirit. Every time God sends you someone, you kill them. What's wrong with you? Now this was one you can't keep down. And God even used human nature and the fact that you're going to kill any messenger he sends to you. He somehow crafted a redemption plan that included knowing that you're going to murder any messenger he sent to you as the pinnacle of all human redemption. It's crazy.
It's wild.
Yeah.
Hopefully you're out there just like stunned at this message, because every time we talk about it, it's just like, it's so stunning. It's mind-boggling. It's breathtaking. It's beautiful. It's confusing. You continue to learn about it each and every day. It's something, and your heart
and
almost
it's plain.
wants to,
it's plain, and it's expressed and described in the New Testament. So like Paul and the other authors will point back to all this and be like, do you guys see this? Like, look at what happened and how it worked out. So that's the crazy thing, is like, in order to disbelieve Christianity, you have to simultaneously believe that these are all a bunch of like ancient idiots who made junk up in an old world where they didn't know better. And then at the same time, these ancient idiots who didn't know anything somehow wrote the most cohesive story over millennia that all culminated in an event that just happened and the whole world saw before their own eyes, that fulfilled everything that was written about in their book that they wrote with multiple authors over 2,000 years or more. And it all ended up like this perfectly written narrative, like it was just written down by one guy, but everyone knew it was written over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. So it's, how are these people idiots, or are they brilliant, or did God write the story? Right. And, it's either the greatest conspiracy that went over hundreds of generations, which, I just think takes a lot more. That's a harder to believe, that like humans can be that consistently conspiratorial for generations and generations. Then it's just simply true. Because even as they're writing it, they don't even know what they're writing. They're just writing what they experienced in their time. And you look back at the whole thing, you're like, how did we miss this? It's all there. It's like, you read the Old Testament now as a Christian, you're like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
It's all right here. Like, how did they not see it?
Right. I want to talk about our response to this, because hopefully a lot of people out there, Easter season, you're rethinking a lot of these things. And hopefully as you're listening to this, you're like, wow, there's a good leg to stand on when it comes to faith and Christianity. And so I feel like Romans 6 was a great conversation about how we should respond to this. And so the passage you landed on was Romans 6 verses 3-4. And so I want to read Romans 6:3 to start out with. Don't you know that all of us who were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? And so there's a couple of things about this passage, the baptism language. and specifically baptism into his death. And so you might be thinking out there, like, how does these events that we've been talking about that have taken place in history, how do they apply to me today? How are they still, the movement that we've been talking about? It continues on. So what does that look like for me today? And the first point would be you are baptized into something new. You are baptized into Christ Jesus and baptized into his death. Pastor Danny, why is baptism into Christ Jesus and into his death so critical as like a starting point in terms of people's fresh start that we were talking about on Sunday?
Yeah, so there's two simultaneous images going on here. One is the image of Christian baptism. And so Paul's most likely calling back to, hey, those of you who were baptized, like you were dunked under the water. And so when you were baptized, dunked under the water, you were dunked into the water into Christ's death. The other image that comes out in this whole concept of baptism, baptizo is the Greek word, which most of the time that word was used in Greek society was not about a religious act, but was just a common term to describe what happened when you would like dye a garment. And so if you have like a white t-shirt like I'm wearing right here, and you wanted to turn it red, you would baptize it into a bucket of red dye, and then you'd bring it out. And after you baptize it into this bucket, it comes out and it's a new creation. Now it's a red t-shirt, not a white t-shirt. It's not a white t-shirt with red on it. It has changed in some way.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the fascinating kind of interplay between these two concepts of Christian baptism and classic baptism is that Paul's drawing on both here to saying you were baptized into Christ Jesus. You were put under the water in your ritual act of baptism as a Christian, but you were baptized into Christ's death. So it's almost like Christ's death is this vat of dye, and you were put into Christ's death. And when you came out of the waters of ritual baptism, you've been inexplainably and forever marked. You're no longer this old creation. Now you're this new creation. You're a red shirt, not a white shirt. And the color is not red. The color is Christ's death. And so somehow you've gone into the baptism waters and you come out marked with the death and resurrection he'll move into of Jesus Christ. And so somehow, that's why I talked on Sunday about being super glued to Jesus. What Paul is arguing is what happened to Jesus on Easter weekend has happened to anyone who believes. That if you became a Christian, you somehow participate in the death of Christ. And so your death has happened. You participate in the resurrection of Christ. So your new life has emerged and you've been marked, changed by the experience that it wasn't just this event 2,000 years ago that you think about, but somehow you were with him in the grave. You were with him in the empty tomb. And now you are living a life where you've died and now you have a new life too. And so you've become this Christian, this little Christ, because the same thing that happened to him happened to you through the same Spirit that raised him from the dead as well.
I think this conversation reminds me of even Paul's conversation in Romans about like the first Adam and the second Adam, where the first Adam, the story was that, hey, we associate with the sin of Adam and Eve. We are, we are associated with them forever in that story. And it almost is like Paul is saying, now that the second Adam, which is Jesus, the more perfect human being, God in the flesh, he's come to introduce a new story. And now we can, through faith, align with his story, which is pretty cool. It's pretty cool to think about, like going back to Jesus being the fulfillment of the entire Old Testament story and him seeing himself as such. You enter into, become a red shirt, I suppose. That's a great analogy. Is there any significance about just like thinking about death here? Like it's just like a really stark image. I mean, do I actually die? Like what dies when I am baptized into Christ Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that dies. I think there's a verse that says, you've died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, you'll also appear with him in glory. So this idea, I also think of a story from church history. Who is the guy that I'm thinking of? Is it I'm going to think of his name as I'm telling the story, but there was a famous conversion story in church history where a guy who became a pastor used to be just a terrible guy, just a womanizer, that kind of thing. And so he had this experience where he was sitting in his yard or whatever, and he heard this voice that said, take up and read. And so he started reading the Bible and he was converted and God changed his life. And as he was walking down the street a few weeks, months, years, whatever it was later, he ran into a woman that he used to associate with in his old life as he was running around and doing all the things that he was doing in his old life. And she tried to flag him down. She's like, hey, it's me. And he's like, hey, yeah, but it's no longer me. like that guy is dead and the guy you're looking at is a new guy, like he's gone. Right. And so it's kind of hard to encapsulate what dies within us. Like, because most of like the stuff that was in him was still there. Like our flesh is still there. Like the world is still there. The enemy, the devil is still there. But what Paul starts to explain that has died is one thing that's died is our connection to sin. That sin used to be our master and like we were chained to him, like a slave chained to a master or to a pole or something. And that has been severed. So that relationship between us and sin is now dead. And so now we're free, and we're free to go submit ourselves to God and present the members of our bodies to God to say, God, I want to serve you with my hands and feet now. Like our sin nature is not dead, but we do see this sanctification process where more and more of our old desires start to die and wither out. And some new desires are born and birthed. Like Jonathan Edwards in America in like the 18th century talks about religious affections, that we have these new emotions and affections that kind of grow up out of us and our old, kind of the things like the hymn says, the things of earth grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And so there's this kind of conversion is the word I'm thinking of, like from dark to light, from death to life, as some of the things in our life begin to die. At the same time, also what dies is the weight of sin. It's almost like we get to release it, and we're no longer culpable for our sin. We get to put it at the foot of the cross. We don't have to die for our sin anymore. And so our death sentence is put to death. Death itself is put to death. Like we get the experience of dying in the midst of this life, so we don't experience eternal death. And so we get this new life that starts now and lasts us into eternity. And so it's almost like you get to have a funeral service for yourself in the midst of this life, and you get to start living resurrection life now is some of the image that you are now a Christian, and for the rest of the ages into eternity future, you will be living your life with Christ as he's continued to renew you into his image on this new path he's given you.
So let's close out the podcast by talking about that life, because verse 4 says, we were therefore buried with him through baptism into death, in order that, just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life. And I'll just read verse 5 here. For if we have been united or superglued, or we become that new shirt, right? United with him in a death like his, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. So Pastor Danny, a lot of us might be thinking, okay, like I understand that there's life on the other side of this. There's life now that lasts all up into eternity. What does that life really look like? What does it mean that we are now living after our death in this resurrected life? It seems like a very Christian term, resurrected life. Help explain what that might look like.
I mean, again, like death, it means a lot of things.
Yeah.
You know? And I love that it's this idea that, well, you're going to die and then be resurrected. And that's one that like, you don't have to write a sci-fi movie about, because so many sci-fi movies are already written about this, about like some pill that you take and then you die, but then like you wake up again and now you have like immortality, or, you know, you get plugged in this machine and then you die, but then you wake up and now you're in this new post-apocalyptic world or whatever, you know. There's something in us that just knows that when we find the end of ourself, there's like a green pasture on the other side. And so, you know, I can't remember if I said this on Sunday, but there's a verse from Jesus, a teaching of Jesus, where he says that anyone who will lose their life for me will find it. Anyone who wants to hold on to their life is going to lose it. And it is this concept of, okay, you can either hold on to the life you're living now and hold on as long as you can, make as much money as you can, and just try not to lose it. But eventually you're going to die. All your stuff's going to decompose. And now you're going to face your maker and have to give an account for the fact that you've rejected him your whole life. Or you come to the end of yourself in the midst of this life and you say, God, I'm done running after my own agenda. I'm done carrying my own sin. I'm done trying to build riches for myself. I'm done trying to live for me. I'm done listening to the devil, or I'm done listening to what I want to do, or I'm done listening to what the world tells me to do. I want to put all of that behind me and throw it in the garbage. I need something new. And this is the moment where it says, well, God says, I'll forgive your sin in this moment. I'll give you a new purpose in this moment. I'm going to put you on a new pathway in this moment. I'm going to give you new affections and emotions in this moment. I'm going to make everything new in you as you put everything in your old life to death. And so that is kind of where Paul goes as he even walks more into this chapter in Romans, as he says, okay, so You were dead, you were resurrected. So now what do? Do you go back to the way you used to live? No. Do you go rack up a bunch more debt because you just love having God forgive you? No, obviously not. You realize, okay, the connection between you and sin and you and death has been severed. You're free to do whatever you want. So run to God with that freedom and say, God, I want to spend the rest of my days serving you, and present, instead of presenting your members to sin, to say, hey, how can I get into trouble today? Right. Present the members of your body to God. Say, God, how can I use my hands and feet to serve you and bring your good into the world? And as you present yourself and your members to God, he starts to transform you from the inside out, and he changes your heart, your affections, your thoughts, your actions, your trajectory, your legacy. Everything starts to become renewed as you simply drop it all and come to him and say, God, just make me new. And so part of it is like this image of he's the potter, we're the clay. Dying is saying, I'm going to stop trying to sculpt myself, and I'm going to just put myself in the hands of God and say, God, do whatever you want with me. I'm yours now. And we trust that giving our life to God, he will do much better with our lives than we have done in our own, even though it's terrifying because we have to let go of everything.
Right. And I think there's passages even in Romans 8 that talk about becoming more like Jesus, becoming more like Christ, which is staggering considering what we just talked about. Like if Christ is God in the flesh, he's almost teaching us how to live. He's almost giving us a blueprint of what human life truly looks like. And so to become more and more like him each and every day, just kind of a mind-blowing thought of like, I get to live in a way that brings life. Going back to that conversation, it is life-giving, like the God of the Old Testament, life-giving as compared to the other religions. Jesus bringing all these teachings that bring life. And so it is this beautiful invitation.
And some of it is logical, right? So instead of lying, I'm going to tell the truth. Instead of cheating on my wife, I'm going to not, right? Like those type of things. Some of it is there are these new tools we have. We have the Spirit of God now. So it's, okay, I used to just try to do stuff for myself, but now I can talk to God in prayer, and somehow in cooperation with the Spirit of God, the world can change without me touching it. People's lives can change without me even talking to them. Like there's this new, I don't want to reduce the Spirit to a tool, but it's almost like there's this new aspect of ourselves that now, where we used to just do whatever our own spirit told us to do. Now we have the Holy Spirit of God who will carry requests to the Father on our behalf, but who also is going to bring God's will into our own lives. And so you're going to start coming up with these ideas that you would have never come up with before, because now the Spirit of God is directing your steps, not your own spirit who says, go get rich, go do this, do that. So it's not merely the moral stuff. It's in the same way that we have a breath of life within us to make us human. The Spirit of life, the Spirit of God makes us alive. And that's our whole next series is going to be about the Spirit of God. But the Spirit of God makes us alive. And now we are learning to live in a relationship with him and listen to his word instead of our own spirit's word, and live for him, and let the Spirit of God and let Christ himself work through our hands and our feet as we offer them up to him to say, you're calling me to pray for this person. And when I lay my hand on them and pray them, they might be healed because your healing power will flow through me, because now I'm a conduit of the Spirit of God into the life of somebody else. Yeah.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation. And I want to give you a couple next steps because, like I said at the top of the episode, there is a baptism service happening April 27th, which is this upcoming Sunday. So if you are intrigued by anything we're talking about and you say, I have faith. Yeah, I have faith that this happened 2,000 years ago, that Jesus rose from the grave, that he died for my sins. What a great next step. What a great next step, especially as you're talking about the red shirt analogy. That's what's happened to you spiritually. Like you are being super glued to Jesus, and there's no better way to celebrate that than through baptism, that first step that Jesus even takes and gives us an example to follow there. And so invite there, and also an invite to come back. Because like you said, we're going to be talking about what it means to live a Spirit-filled life. And that's sort of the question that this passage leaves us off with Romans 6 of what does life look like? Well, I mean, it's going to look different for everybody. And it's a matter of following the Spirit, which we've already talked about in Corinthians, of being like having the mind of Christ with you and walking in light of that. So Pastor Danny, I'm really excited about this Holy Spirit series.
1 Corinthians 12 is where we pick up next week. I'm excited to jump back into the studio with you to talk about it.
Pastor Danny, thanks so much.